You are looking at houses right now, or you were, and somewhere between the third Zillow session this week and another conversation about interest rates that left you more confused than when it started, a quiet resignation has started setting in. Maybe this is just not the right time. Maybe next year will be different. Maybe you just need to wait a little longer. Here is what nobody is saying loudly enough. Waiting has a price, and in this specific market, in 2026, that price is not abstract. It is not theoretical. It is being paid right now, quietly, by millions of Americans who have been waiting since 2022, believing that the market would eventually correct itself back to something that felt fair. It has not, and there are very specific structural reasons why it has not. Reasons that were not just predictable, but were actually predicted, publicly, years before most people started feeling the pain of them. Graham Stephan, one of the most widely followed voices in personal finance and real estate, laid out a framework for exactly this market scenario years ago with a clarity that, looking at where we are standing right now in 2026, feels less like financial commentary and more like a documented warning that most people heard and did not act on. This video is about what that warning actually said, what it means for the market you are trying to navigate right now, and most critically, what you are supposed to do with that information if you are a buyer, a seller, or someone simply trying to figure out whether homeownership is still a realistic part of your financial future. Here is the number that frames everything. According to the National Association of Realtors, housing affordability in America recently hit its lowest point in over 4 decades. Not the lowest point of the last recession, not the lowest point since 2008, the lowest point in over 40 years. Which means that right now, today, buying a home in America is harder relative to income than it has been at almost any point in modern history. And yet the conversation most people are having is still centered around whether interest rates are going to drop another half point, as if that single variable is the thing standing between them and a functional housing market. It is not, and understanding why requires going back to the structural argument that voices like Graham were making when most people were still caught up in the euphoria of the pandemic-era real estate boom. Here is the core of what that argument was. The American housing market was not just experiencing a temporary price spike driven by low interest rates and pandemic-era demand. It was experiencing a fundamental structural imbalance between supply and demand that had been quietly building for over a decade, and that could not be resolved simply by raising interest rates, because the problem was never purely about demand, it was about supply. Specifically, the catastrophic underbuilding of housing in America following the 2008 financial crisis, which left the country millions of units short of what a growing population actually needed. A deficit that accumulated silently for years while everyone was focused on other things. Think about a bathtub with the drain partially blocked. You can turn down the tap, which is what raising interest rates effectively does to demand, but if the drain is still blocked, the tub does not empty, it just fills more slowly. That is the housing market you are sitting in right now. Demand has been cooled, but the structural supply problem was never fixed, and a bathtub filling slowly is still a bathtub filling. Here is what this means for the specific decisions you are facing right now, and why the conventional wisdom circulating in most conversations about this market is not just incomplete but potentially leading people toward decisions they will regret on both sides of the transaction. Because there is something specific happening in 2026 that was not part of the original warning, a new layer on top of the structural problem that is changing the calculus for buyers and sellers simultaneously in ways that almost nobody is talking about clearly enough. Here is the new layer, and it is the one that makes 2026 genuinely different from every previous year of this affordability crisis, in a way that should change how you are thinking about every decision in this market right now. The lock-in effect has matured into something far more structurally damaging than anyone initially anticipated. Here is what this means in plain language. When interest rates rose sharply from historic lows, millions of existing homeowners who had locked in mortgages at 2 and 3% suddenly found themselves in a position where selling their home and buying another one would mean trading a 2.9% mortgage for something hovering around 6, 7, sometimes higher. The monthly payment difference on that trade is not marginal. On a median-priced home, it can represent hundreds, sometimes over $1,000 more per month for the same or lesser quality of housing. So they stayed. Overwhelmingly, they stayed. And when existing homeowners do not sell, existing inventory does not enter the market. And when existing inventory does not enter the market, the already severe supply deficit gets compounded by a secondary freeze that has nothing to do with how many homes exist, and everything to do with how many homeowners are willing to give up the financial position they currently occupy. According to data from Redfin, the share of outstanding mortgages with rates below 4% remained extraordinarily high heading into 2026, representing millions of homeowners effectively locked into their current properties by the financial logic of their own mortgage terms. This is the part of the 2026 housing market that Graham's framework predicted with uncomfortable precision. Not just that prices would remain elevated, but that the combination of structural undersupply and mortgage lock-in would create a market characterized by low transaction volume, persistently high prices, and a buyer pool full of people competing for a fraction of the inventory that a healthy market would normally offer, which is exactly the market you are trying to buy in right now. So what does this actually mean for you as a buyer in this environment? Here is the first thing you need to understand, and it goes against almost everything the conventional wait-and-see advice is telling you. In a market defined by structural undersupply and lock-in-driven inventory freeze, waiting for prices to drop significantly is not a strategy, it is a hope. And the distinction between those two things is costing people years of equity building and mortgage paydown that they are never going to recover. Here is the math that makes this concrete. Every year you rent while waiting for a market correction that structural supply constraints make unlikely in the near term, you are paying someone else's mortgage instead of your own. On a median American rent of approximately $1,700 a month, that is over $20,000 a year, leaving your hands with zero equity, zero appreciation potential, and zero mortgage paydown attached to it. Over 3 years of waiting, that is $60,000 in rent payments that built nothing for your financial future, in addition to whatever appreciation occurred on the home you did not buy. This is not an argument that buying always beats renting. It is not that simple, and anyone telling you it is always one or the other is selling you something. But it is an argument that in a market with the specific structural characteristics of 2026, the cost of waiting needs to be calculated honestly and completely, not just emotionally. Now here is where the seller side of this equation becomes equally complicated, because the lock-in effect creates a trap that works in both directions. If you are a homeowner right now considering selling, you are facing a decision that is genuinely more complex than any previous market cycle has presented. Your equity position may be extraordinary, but your next purchase exists in the same market you are selling into, which means the windfall you are sitting on is simultaneously the barrier to your next move, because whatever you net from the sale, you are spending in a market that is just as elevated as the one you are leaving. This is the part of the 2026 housing conversation that most people are not having at a level of honesty that actually helps anyone make a better decision. And it requires us to go somewhere most housing market discussions carefully avoid, the actual framework for deciding what the right move is for your specific situation. Not the market in general, but your situation specifically, because the answer is not the same for everyone sitting inside this market. That framework, and the specific questions it requires you to answer honestly, is exactly where we are going next. Here is the framework. And the reason most housing market conversations never get here is because this part requires honesty about your specific numbers rather than general market commentary, and honesty about specific numbers is uncomfortable in a way that talking about interest rates and inventory levels never quite is. The first question the framework asks is this: are you buying a home or are you buying a financial instrument? Because in 2026, those two motivations lead to completely different decisions, and almost nobody is being clear with themselves about which one they are actually making. If you are buying a home, the calculation centers on your monthly payment relative to your income, the stability it provides your life, the roots it allows you to put down, the control it gives you over your living situation that renting structurally cannot. These are real, legitimate, financially relevant considerations that do not show up in a price-to-rent ratio calculation, but that absolutely belong in the full accounting of what homeownership is worth to a specific human life. If the payment is manageable, if the location serves your actual life, if you are planning to stay for at least 5 to 7 years, the structural argument for buying in 2026 is stronger than the emotional climate around this market suggests. But if you are buying primarily as a financial investment, expecting significant near-term appreciation to validate the purchase, the 2026 market requires a much more honest conversation, because here is what the structural analysis actually says about near-term price appreciation in this environment. Prices are being held up not by robust economic health or surging demand, but by the supply freeze created by the lock-in effect. That is a fragile foundation for appreciation. It is not the same as prices rising because the economy is generating genuine new wealth and genuine new demand at scale. It is prices being artificially compressed into a narrow band by a temporary structural condition that will eventually resolve, even if the timeline for that resolution remains genuinely uncertain. Here is something Graham's framework has consistently emphasized that most mainstream housing commentary glosses over entirely. The biggest financial mistakes in real estate are almost never made by people who bought in imperfect markets. They are made by people who bought the wrong property for the wrong reasons at the wrong stage of their personal financial life, regardless of what the broader market was doing at the time. A purchase that stretches you beyond what your income can comfortably sustain does not become a good decision because the market eventually appreciates. It becomes a years-long source of financial stress that colors every other financial decision you make in the meantime. So, here is the honest version of the framework applied to 2026 specifically. If your debt-to-income ratio after the purchase stays below 43%, the threshold most financial planners consider the outer boundary of sustainable housing cost. If you have a genuine emergency fund that survives the down payment intact, if you are planning to hold the property for a minimum of 5 years, and if the purchase serves your actual life, rather than a speculative bet on appreciation, then the structural argument for buying now, even in this market, even at these rates, is real. Because every month you own is a month of equity building, mortgage paydown, and potential appreciation that renting categorically cannot replicate. But if any one of those conditions is not true for your specific situation right now, the market does not care about your timeline. The market does not owe you a correction because you have been waiting patiently. And buying outside your actual financial capacity in a market already defined by affordability stress is not catching up. It is compounding a problem on top of a problem. Here is the final thought this entire video has been building toward, and it is the one that reframes everything. The 2026 housing market is not a crisis you are a passive victim of. It is a set of specific structural conditions that reward people who understand them and punish people who are operating on assumptions inherited from a market that no longer exists. The people who are going to look back on 2026 as the year they made the right call are not going to be the ones who timed the market perfectly. They are going to be the ones who made the decision that was right for their specific financial life, with clear eyes about what this market actually is, rather than what they were hoping it would become. The warning was always less about the market and more about the clarity required to navigate it. That clarity, applied honestly to your own numbers, your own timeline, your own life, is the only housing market strategy that has ever actually worked, in any market, at any point in history. If this gave you a more honest framework for thinking about one of the biggest financial decisions of your life, subscribe, because we break down the real mechanics behind the markets and money decisions that actually affect your life every single week. Drop a like if this reframed how you are seeing the 2026 housing market. It helps more people find this conversation before they make a decision based on assumptions that no longer apply. And if you know someone right now agonizing over whether to buy or keep waiting, send them this video. The framework in it might be exactly what they need before they decide.